Mohammed, you say there are 5 key insights going forward that we learned from the Obama tenure. So let's start with what's the first big thing that you learned during the last 8 years?
The first thing is that the U.S. is no longer living just in cyclical space economically, but importantly in structural space. And had we realized that earlier, then the recovery that we got in the last 8 years would have been much deeper, much more meaningful, and would have impacted many more people.
You also make the point that you need a credible medium-term economic vision, because without that, there's no framework to support policy initiatives and formulation and business plans that you get buy-in from other parts of the government. Looking ahead to the Trump administration, do you see a credible medium-term economic vision that's already kind of in place?
It's not in place, it's evolving. They've identified certain targets on growth, on jobs. I think they have to bring it all together in a macroeconomic framework. And that's going to be critical because you've got to give people a sense of direction and you've got to give businesses clarity on what comes up. So it's really important. And this is quite a shift for us because we used to live in cyclical space and think that the long term is fine. But we're finding out that we need to shift the economy from being very short-term focused to being longer-term focused.
You know, in addition to the fact that we have a change of administration from Obama to Trump, from Democrat to Republican, we're also going from divided government to unified government, which seems like a fundamental change and sort of this is a new regime. How important will that be that whatever Trump's economic vision is, he'll actually have a chance to perhaps execute on it, unlike Obama, who is constantly clashing with Congress?
Is critical, Joe. I mean, if you look at the last 6 years, there's been virtually no economic policy making beyond the Fed. Why? Because whatever was presented to Congress, Congress simply didn't want to be seen as collaborating, as the two sides collaborating to get something done. That is now behind us. Hopefully, we will get things done. And what's interesting is that the market is welcoming certain policies by President Trump, by the president-elect, that President Obama tried to pursue, but Congress frustrated it.
Right, but now you've got a situation where the government can execute on it. So we seem to have found some unity when it comes to the domestic government, but you still need a structure when it comes to global policy coordination. Is what the Trump administration proposing so far off from what other governments, other central banks in the world are proposing, or pursuing, for that matter?
So there's a carrot and stick approach, and the carrot is through better global policy coordination, which requires also a better structure in the G20. The stick is to threaten protectionism, and when it comes from the biggest economy in the world, it is quite a big stick. I think you're going to have to find a balance between carrot and stick. The key issue is that our success depends on other countries also getting their act together. It relates to the discussion we had earlier with Mike McKee on the dollar, and it also relates to the fact that we are very interconnected, both on the consumption side and the production side. So we need other countries to also get their act together.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up exactly on that point. When you look around the world and see regions or countries that need to get their act together, what are you referring to specifically? Who needs to do what?
Number one, Europe. Europe is way below potential. It is also over-reliant on monetary policy, and it has fiscal room in Germany, for example, and it has need for structural reforms. Second would be Japan. Third would be China.
You know, you said that the U.S. economy no longer lives in a cyclical space. Isn't that the case for all these other developed economies, including some of the emerging economies as well, like China, which faces its own structural headwinds?
Absolutely. I mean, the lesson is that structural issues are no longer limited to the developing world, to the emerging world, that they have become also an issue for the developed world. Why? Because we invested in the wrong growth model. We over-relied on finance a decade ago, and we now have to figure out genuine engines of growth.
Do you get the impression that leaders, policymakers are internalizing these things and prepared to do what it takes? Or is this just going to be, more talk and we'll just be back here in a year or 2 years with the same frustrations?
I think the growth of the anti-establishment movements on both sides of the Atlantic is making the establishment think a lot more about these issues. So we have come a long way. I remember in 2009 and 2010, when my PIMCO colleague and I would argue that structural issues matter and that we no longer live in cyclical space, we were told, no, that's not the case. Advanced economies are not like the emerging world. Well, guess what? We are a little bit like the emerging world, and we have to deal with structural issues. Japan can happen in Europe and is happening in Europe.